Today, we are going to discuss the doctrine of not self, anatta, in Theravada Buddhism. Buddhism is the teaching of Lord Gautama Buddha. Lord Gautama Buddha lived and taught in North India in the 6th and 5th century before Christ. He was born into a royal family as Prince Siddhartha in a place called Lumbini in the present-day Nepal. Being a royal prince, he grew up with all the royal comforts, but he was prevented from seeing any human suffering outside his palace. However, when he was a young adult, he witnessed human suffering in the form of old age, illness, and death. When he came to know that this human suffering is common to everybody, including himself and his loved ones, that alarmed and shocked him. And he wanted to find a way out of human suffering. So at the age of 29, he left home and became a homeless ascetic, wanting to find a way out of human suffering. For the next 6 years, he practiced severe austerity and self-mortification, believing that it will bring enlightenment and liberation from suffering. But it did not. So 6 years later, he gave up severe austerity and self-mortification and started meditating under a tree in a place called Bodh Gaya in India. And he was successful. Through meditation, he realized the Four Noble Truths, eradicated all his mental defilements, and attained enlightenment as a Samma Sambuddha. Now, having attained enlightenment, the Buddha wanted to teach the Buddhist doctrine and the path of liberation from suffering to others as well, so that they could cultivate the same path and liberate themselves from suffering. The Four Noble Truths that the Buddha realized during the process of enlightenment are the truth of universal suffering, dukkha satya, the truth of the origin of suffering, samudaya satya, the truth of the cessation of suffering, nirodha satya, and the truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering, magga satya. Now, during the process of enlightenment, the Buddha also realized the three universal characteristics of all physical and mental phenomena. The Buddha discovered that everything in this universe, physical and mental, is a conditioned phenomenon, conditioned by antecedent causes and conditions. And Buddha said, all these physical and mental phenomena are impermanent, anicca, leads to suffering, dukkha, and have no permanent entity. called a self or soul, anatta. So according to Buddha's doctrine, everything in this universe is conditioned. They are impermanent and subject to change. And whatever is impermanent and subject to change is unsatisfactory and suffering. And whatever is impermanent and suffering cannot have a permanent entity called self or soul, which can be called I, me, or mine. But due to our ignorance and perverted thinking, we consider what is impermanent as permanent. We consider what is suffering as pleasurable. We consider what is not self as self, and we consider what is unattractive as attractive. Now, the doctrine of impermanence and suffering, they were known to other Eastern religions in India at the time of the Buddha. But the doctrine of not self was discovered by the Buddha and is unique to Buddhism. Now, the three universal characteristics of impermanence, suffering, and not self always exist in the world. But when Samma Sambuddha appears in the world, the Buddha rediscovers it and says it to the world. During the time of the Buddha, there were two doctrines in relation to life after death. The first was the theory of eternalism, Sasvatavada. And according to that theory, there is a permanent entity in all beings called a self, which keeps transmigrating from one life to the next life. And the second theory was what's called annihilationism, Uchchedavada. It was also called nihilism or materialism. They also believed in self. They believed that both the body and the self are one and the same. They both annihilate after death. And Buddha rejected both these theories and presented a middle path in the form of a dependent origination, which we will discuss later. Now, in the Eastern religions, the concept of Atman in Sanskrit and Atta in Pali existed. And they refer to this permanently abiding entity called self, which can also be described as ego or the soul. And they believe that it is this entity, the self or soul, that thinks and that feels feelings. And they also believe that it is this entity which experiences happiness, unhappiness, and also performs good or bad actions, karma. And this entity will be reborn in a good or bad place according to the quality of their karma. And they will experience the consequence of those actions. Now, in Buddhist scriptures also, we can see that terms like self, satta, and puggala are being used. But it is used only for the purpose of describing an individual or to distinguish one person from another person, only for conventional purposes. And they don't indicate any permanent entity called a self or soul. Now, the Pali word for not self is anatta. It's a composite Pali word. An meaning without or not, and atta meaning self or soul. So the English meaning of anatta is not self. The Buddhist doctrine denies the existence of a permanent, independent entity or substance called self, soul, or ego within any individual existence. And Buddha categorically rejected the existence of a permanent self. The Buddha said, what we call an individual or person is nothing but a psychophysical complex, nama rupa, that consists of 5 aggregates of clinging. And these 5 aggregates are interdependent. They cannot exist without each other. The 5 aggregates of clinging are material form, rupa, feeling, vedana, perception, sanya, mental formation, sankara, and consciousness, vijnana. Now, these 5 aggregates, they work together, function together as a group to produce all our experiences. Now, out of the 5 aggregates, the first aggregate of form, rupa, represents our bodily aspects, while the other 4 aggregates, feeling, perception, mental formation, and consciousness, represent all our mental actions. And all the 5 aggregates arise due to other physical and mental antecedent conditions, and they pass away instantly. So they are in a constant state of flux with no stable or permanent entity. Now, through ignorance, we believe that our body or the mind could be our self or soul. But our physical body grows old, becomes ill, and eventually dies. And it's a natural process. We cannot control it, and we have no influence over that process. And similarly, we have no control over our mind. The mind runs around like a wild monkey, cannot stay in one place for a moment. So we have no control over any of the 5 aggregates. And when we identify with them as I or me, naturally it leads to suffering, because they are just transient processes. There is no permanence in any of them. So in the Buddhist doctrine, terms like individual, person, I, or you are used just as a conventional way to describe this empirical self. Now, when the Buddha was alive, the Buddha used to answer any questions put to him in one of 4 ways. He would answer some questions with a categorical answer, such as yes or no. The Buddha would answer some other questions with a qualified answer, defining, redefining terms and in details. The Buddha would answer some other questions with the counter questions. And for some of the questions, the Buddha just kept quiet without giving any answer. There were 10 such questions that the Buddha would not answer. And the two of the questions were, are the soul and the body the same? Is the soul one thing and the body another? Buddha said, believing in either of those two questions either leads to rebirth or to suffering. And Buddha said the reason for not answering those questions was they are not connected with the goal of liberation from suffering. Buddha used to say, I teach only two things, suffering and how to end suffering. The Buddha said, knowing the answers to those questions will not lead to disenchantment, to get rid of craving, or to gain enlightenment. In a discourse called Anatta Sutta of the Samyutta Nikaya, that's a collection of the Buddha's connected discourses. The Buddha was teaching the 5 ascetic companions who had supported him during the 6 years of austerity and self-mortification. This Anatta Sutta, in fact, is the second discourse that Buddha had delivered to the same group of 5 ascetic companions. And Buddha asked the 5 ascetic companions, is form, rupa, permanent or impermanent? And they said impermanent. Is what is impermanent pleasure or suffering? And they said suffering. Is what is impermanent, suffering, and subject to change fit to be regarded as this is mine, this I am, and this is myself? And they said no. And Buddha repeated the same questions with regard to the other 4 aggregates of feeling, perception, mental formation, and consciousness. And through those questions and answers, the Buddha showed that the 5 aggregates are impermanent, suffering, and so cannot be regarded as mine, I am, or myself. And it is said that after this discourse, the 5 ascetic companions realized the truth and gained enlightenment as arahants. Now, if any of the 5 aggregates is described as self, then there should be 3 characteristics to all of them. They should be permanent. They should lead to happiness. And one should have complete control over the 5 aggregates. But the Buddha showed that none of the aggregates have any of those characteristics. So that means there cannot be a self or a permanent soul in any of the 5 aggregates. In another discourse called Phena Pindupama Sutta, again of the Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha likened the 5 aggregates to 5 insubstantial phenomena. The Buddha said, Material form is like a lump of foam with no substance. Feeling is like a water bubble. The perception is like a mirage. Mental formation is like a trunk of a plant and tree with no central hardwood. And consciousness is like an illusion, a magic. In a discourse called Nakula Pitta Sutta of the Samyutta Nikaya, Arahant Sariputta, who was one of the Buddha's two chief disciples, said that through one's ignorance, one takes form, rupa, as self in four different ways. One assumes the form to be oneself, and one assumes that this self is possessing the form. One assumes that the form is within the self, and one assumes the self is within the form. So one takes the form as self or soul in four different ways. And similarly, for feeling, perception, mental formation, and consciousness. So Arahant Sariputta said, it is possible for one to mistake aggregates as a self in 20 different ways. And in a discourse called Sakkaya Sutta of the Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha described the five aggregates of clinging as Sakkaya. And the Buddha said, the wrong view of believing any of the five aggregates as self or soul is called Sakkaya Ditti. And one develops this wrong view, Sakkaya Ditti, in three possible ways. That is, through craving, one takes the aggregates as mine. Through conceit, mana, one takes them as I am. And through wrong view, ditti, one takes them as myself. Now, this self-identification view, or Sakkaya Ditti, is one of 10 fetters, Sangyojana. Now, these fetters are sort of chains or shackles that bind sentient beings to the cycle of birth and death, the samsara. Buddha describes 10 such fetters, and Sakkaya Ditti is the first fetter. So the 10 fetters are self-identity view, Sakkaya Ditti, skeptical doubt, Vichikicha, attachment to mere rites and rituals, Silabhata Paramasa, sensual desire, Kamaraga, ill will, Patiga, desire to be born in fine material Brahma worlds, Ruparaga, desire to be born in formless Brahma worlds, Aruparaga, conceit, Mana, restlessness, Uddacha, and ignorance, Avijja. Now, the 6 sense spaces, that is, the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind, and also their sense objects that they receive, and the mental processes arising from that contact, they are also transient, arising and passing away from moment to moment. So they also have no permanent entity. And in a discourse called Chachakka Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, which is the collection of Buddha's middle-length discourses, The Buddha advised the disciples to reflect sense bases and sense objects as not self. Taking the I, the Buddha said, reflect that I is not self, visual objects are not self, I consciousness is not self, eye contact is not self, feelings arising from eye contact are not self, and craving arising from the feelings is not self. And similarly for the other 5 sense bases of the ear, nose, tongue, body, and the mind. So because all these sense bases, sense objects, and their mental processes arise and pass away instantly, if there is a self in them, that self should also arise and pass away from moment to moment. In the Asuttava Sutta of the Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha said, if some ordinary person wants to believe in a self or soul, it is better to believe body as the self, because one can see at least the body lasting for some time, for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. But the mind does not last for more than a moment, because the mind arises and passes away like a wild monkey in the jungle who cannot stay still. Now, dependent origination, paticca samuppada, is another Buddhist doctrine that the Buddha discovered during the process of enlightenment. The dependent origination explains that every physical and mental phenomenon in this universe is caused by conditioned and conditioning factors as a process with no stable entity responsible for that. And the dependent origination is the mechanism that shows how we continue to exist in this cycle of birth and death, and also how suffering begins. And the Buddha said there are 12 condition and conditioning factors. And Buddha described the process like this. Conditioned by ignorance, mental formations arise. Conditioned by mental formations, consciousness arises. Conditioned by consciousness, mind and matter arises. Conditioned by mind and matter, 6 sense spaces arise. Conditioned by 6 sense spaces, contact arises. Conditioned by contact, feeling arises. Conditioned by feeling, craving arises. Conditioned by craving, clinging arises. Conditioned by clinging, becoming arises. Conditioned by becoming, birth arises. And because of birth, all forms of suffering like aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, despair arises. Now let us look at the relationship between not self and karma. The karma is the law of cause and effect, which says that every cause has an effect. And the karma process is a natural process. It does not need a judge or a superpower to sit in judgment. And karma is not an entity, it's just a process, sort of an energy that produces eventual results. According to Buddhist doctrine, The karma are actions which are intentional and volitional, either mental or verbal or physical actions. If the actions are good, wholesome, and skillful, they can lead to good results. And if they are bad, unwholesome, and unskillful, those actions can lead to bad results, either in this life or future lives. Now, those who have not realized this not self nature, they believe that it's I who do the karma and I will experience the results. Now, one can legitimately ask the question, if there is no permanent self, then who does the karma and who reaps the results of the karma? The volitional actions, according to Buddhist doctrine, are all conditioned acts. There is no permanent consciousness in us. The consciousness is a stream of consciousness that arises and passes away from moment to moment. What happens is when an intentional action is done, the potential or the energy to produce a result keep moving with the stream of consciousness. And when the conditions are right, then that karma energy will produce the result. It's similar to a mango tree. A mango tree does not store any mango fruits. But when the conditions are right, then the mango tree will start producing fruits. And the sum of the remaining karma potential or the karma energy will decide the next birth. So the consciousness at the time of death contained in this karma energy will influence the consciousness of the next birth. And the karma energy also passes to the new consciousness. So the person who reaps the results of karma is not the same person, but it's not a different person either. Both doing and reaping the results of any karma is just a conditioned process. It does not need a self or a person. Now let us look at the relationship between not self and rebirth. Now in the Buddhist teaching, rebirth is called re-becoming, punabhava. So there is no soul transmigrating from one body to another body after death. And it is a constantly changing stream of consciousness that influences the next stream of consciousness in the next birth. As I said before, this process goes on during one's life. That is, a consciousness arises, exists for a short time, and passes away, influencing another stream of consciousness. And this is what happens at the time of death as well. Now, the newly born being is not the same person, but not an independent person either. Because it is a different consciousness, it's not the same person, but because that new consciousness is linked to the previous consciousness through karma energy, it's not a completely independent person either. One can say it is similar to a flame passing from one lamp to another lamp. Now, when one lamp is lit from another lamp, nothing significant passes from the first lamp to the second lamp. But still, the first lamp is the cause of the flame in the second lamp. The flame from the first lamp did not move to the second lamp. What it did was, it merely raised the temperature of the second lamp, providing the right condition for the second lamp flame to arise. In Buddhist teaching, the use of terms like person and individual is merely for conventional purposes. So instead of a soul or self, the Buddhist doctrine describes a person just as a collection of physical and mental aggregates, the five aggregates of clinging. And none of the aggregates are permanent, and they are all insubstantial and transient in a state of flux. So when one identifies with them as I or me, it can lead to various mental defilements, suffering, and repeated existence in the birth and death. It is only through the cultivation of the Noble Eightfold Path, the Buddhist path of liberation, that one can completely get rid of this wrong concept of I and me. There are 8 factors in the Noble Eightfold Path: right view, samadhi, right intention, samma sankappa, right speech, samma vacha, right action, samma kammanta, right livelihood, samma ajiva, right effort, samma vayama, right mindfulness, samma sati, and right concentration, samma samadhi. Now, for practical purposes, these 8 factors can be divided into 3 groups. The first group is morality, sila, and that consists of right speech, right action, and right livelihood. The second group is concentration, samadhi. That consists of right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And the third group is wisdom, panya. That consists of right understanding and right intention. Now, when one cultivates the Noble Eightfold Path successfully, the final result is enlightenment, or the state of Nibbana. And one gains enlightenment and the state of Nibbana through 4 progressive supramundane stages. The first stage is stream enterer, Sotapanna. Second stage is one's returner, Sakadagami. Third stage is a non-returner, Anagami. And the final stage of enlightenment is Arahant. So an enlightened Arahant has fully realized the concept of not self and has attained the state of Nibbana with no more rebirth in the cycle of birth and death. Thank you very much.